Hello and welcome to Design Emergency. I'm Alice Rawsthorn, co-founder of Design Emergency with Paola Antonelli, and we're thrilled that this episode marks the return of one of our favourite forces in design, the Australian-born, US-based designer, ecologist and activist, Julia Watson. I had the pleasure of interviewing Julia for Design Emergency a few years ago about her book Lo-TEK, Design by Radical Indigenism, which for me is one of the most important design books of recent years. So I'm delighted to be interviewing her again about her next book, Lo-TEK Water, which will be published by Taschen in June. In it, Julia draws on over 20 years of research into using ancient, indigenous, nature-based technologies to design climate-resilient systems, which will enable us to make more efficient use of our precious water while defending us against the devastation it can cause in storm surges, floods and sea level rises. In Lo-TEK Water, Julia shares examples of how local communities across our planet have, in many cases for centuries, designed floating meadows and farms, natural fishing networks, terraced crop cultivation systems, and other projects to safeguard water and to protect us from its extremes, while also suggesting how they can be developed to function at scale, always respecting and protecting the rights of the people who conceived them. So Julia, your first book, Lo-TEK, Design by Radical Indigenism, was a great success. Luckily, I'm not its only fan, and continues to be a catalyst for debate within design and ecological circles. Why did you decide to write a second book, and why focus on water?
So the reason I decided to write a second book was there were so many incredible questions that came up after the release of the first book. So many insightful observations and ponderings from people from across the globe that really kept me thinking and kept me wanting to learn more about the topic and to dive deeper into what I felt like was a bit of a fire that had been sparked. And so this second book is really continuing this conversation with my readers and with all the communities who I've worked with and who've contributed to the first book, and also inviting a whole lot of other communities and other experts into this conversation. And so I think it's important to talk about writing a book as well and talk about the context of Lo-TEK as a conversation. And there's a really incredible indigenous storyteller and author. His name is Taschen, and he wrote an incredible book called Sand Talk that came out at the same time as my book. And he talks about, with indigenous communities, all these stories that pass through generations between people for thousands and thousands of years. They are conversations and everybody's building on one another. And he calls them yarns. And a yarn is someone telling a story and then another person adding to that. And within this general flow of conversation between two different people or two different communities, there's never a shooting down of knowledge. There's always a building and a very open exploration of all these concepts and understandings, building on what has been thought about, conceived and observed before. And so I think this book is just another step in that lineage of what I call in the book millions of conversations over thousands of generations.
And why did you choose water as the theme? Because obviously that was part of the first Lo-TEK book and the overall Lo-TEK project, but there were many other issues you could have chosen to focus on.
The reason I chose water is because one of my most memorable moments as a child, which I think there's a generation of people who can recall this and a generation of people who are younger that cannot. But I remember at 11 years old sitting in front of the television watching this devastating oil spill. It was called the Exxon Valdez. And there were hundreds of thousands of sea creatures that we were being shown that actually were really greatly affected and died. And it was the biggest oil spill that had ever happened in the US. And it was, I think, the first major environmental catastrophe that was broadcast on channels across the globe. And I remember sitting there as a young kid and just horrified, and also watching little birds that were covered in tar, almost unrecognizable, being washed in household detergent. And these images are just seared into my mind. And I remember really kind of understanding that water isn't something that's dead or just this something for us to use. It is this incredible life force, and it provides so much for so many creatures, for humanity. It covers 70% of our earth. And there's this incredible other quote in the book by a futurist that says it's so interesting that we call this planet Earth when really it should be called ocean. And I think that water is just such an incredibly powerful symbol of life that we really just overlook today. And we don't really maintain a connection to water that I think that we should. And I think as designers, understanding our ability to connect with water is and will become an incredibly powerful tool for the future. And I hope that this book is one of those steps towards building that connection to really co-create the type of future on the planet that we want to live on.
And how did your approach to the writing and also to the structure of this book differ from the first one?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think as an author, the first book, I had written academic papers. I was a professor for about 10 years before Lo-TEK came out. And I'd also had about 15 years working with indigenous communities. So I had a very strong knowledge base in understanding how to respectfully and reciprocally work with indigenous and local communities, how to co-create research and how to document. But I still didn't have the practice for a book. And so with that particular first book, I had worked with communities, I reached out to communities, I interviewed experts from those communities, and there was so much involvement from communities in that first book. But what I didn't do is I did not co-author with indigenous experts and with indigenous communities. And so this next book, I really tried to understand the absolute best practice coming from indigenous communities on how indigenous knowledge should be represented, how to go about approaching communities, how to work with communities, how to document their knowledge, how to make their voices the voices that are telling the stories about their knowledge, and to help to keep that knowledge under their control and under their authority, which it always should be. And so accompanying this book, besides having authored every chapter with indigenous experts, the foreword for this particular book, Lo-TEK Water, is written with now a very good friend of mine, an incredible indigenous Diné Navajo woman and scientist, Dr. Lila June Johnson, who's also just an amazing activist, an amazing mind, and we study very similar systems. And so she has written the foreword for this book, which really encapsulates the perspective of indigenous communities and their relationship to the body of work that I'm presenting. And of course, with this second book, I had a really strong foundation of what was to come. And so I knew how to navigate finding permissions for over 300 different images, how to work with communities for them to work on the illustrations with us, how to have review processes, how to compensate experts for working with me and co-authoring with me. And so that was a really big, I think, maturing of how I worked as an author and as a documenter and a co-collaborator and a co-creator of sort of this foundation of work, and enabling a co-creation process to actually truly happen.
Well, from the reader's perspective, it really animates all the projects, and it is very exciting, very engaging to hear the different voices in it. I mean, it works beautifully for the reader as well as hopefully for the communities you're writing about. Now, the book's divided into different sections, and the first one includes examples of ancient nature-based ways of using design to develop different water systems and to diffuse the threats posed by the climate emergency. Could you share a couple of those examples and explain why you chose them?
Yeah, of course. The first half of the book, it's quite similar in terms of the structure, that it resembles Lo-TEK, designed by radical indigenism. And so it's this series of case studies. There's actually 22 case studies. That section of the book is also divided into 3 different water types. So rather than different ecosystem types like the first book, this is water types. There's salty, brackish, and fresh. And so from those 3 different water types, I'm going to give you 2 examples. The Chinampas, which is a system that was the first system that was designed and constructed by the Nahua Xochimilco. And they were the people that preceded the Aztec Empire in what is now known as Mexico City. So these are raised bed agricultural gardens that also once were the foundation of the entire Aztec Empire and the city that existed before Mexico City. This system is incredibly productive. It's incredibly versatile, expandable as a construction system that makes it not only exist in a wetland environment, but also as almost like a pastoral system with these raised beds. And one little known fact about this particular system, which it now still provides vegetables and foods and firewood, and it also is the sort of underbelly of the flower growing industry that from Mexico City, is it also cleans 60% of the water that is coming out of Mexico City, the wastewater, the sewerage water, as it travels through this informal system. And it is cleaned, working its way through. And it's talked about that there are these 1,000-year, 1,500-year-old microbes that are sitting in the sludge at the bottom of this once extraordinarily large lake system that has been shrunk, that this Chinampa system now exists within. That is really quite unique and is cleaning all of the waste and eating all of the detritus that's coming out of the city. And what is so interesting is the system is maintained by grabbing that sludge and mud and putting it onto the top of these agricultural plots that sit above the water to create fertilizer. So it's really this incredibly regenerative agricultural water cleansing system that still exists and was the foundation of one of the most incredible and dense urban cities that existed. The city that was built by the Aztecs was far greater and far more advanced than any cities that were around Europe at that time. And so it really was the foundation of an incredibly progressive, nature-based civilization that we can really see. We still see the vestiges of that civilization now. And so the second system that I wanted to speak to is called the Kayanilum. It is often talked about as the Little Netherlands system. It is really similar technology to the Polderdijk system, which keeps the seawater in the Netherlands, which is below sea level, from inundating vast landscapes. So we have a really similar system in Kerala, which protects this area that is now known as the Kuttanad, which is these backwaters that were constructed about 500 years ago, fully reconstructed from a whole wetland area. It was initially constructed by the nobility to create farming land, and it was taken over by the lower castes. This particular system is the only below seawater paddy farming system that exists in all of India. It's incredibly unique. And not only is it incredibly unique in that it's a below sea level agricultural system, it also exists within the monsoon. It is flooded, becomes a freshwater system where shrimp and aquaculture cultivation happens. So it's this saltwater brackish system that allows seawater in and cultivates brackish and saltwater fish at one season of the year. Not only that, we have this system of aquaculture that's really existing in a salty environment that is incredibly unique, and a type of system that I think is an incredible precedent for agricultural systems that are existing in a coastal area. As what is known by most designers and ecologists, salt water is incredibly damaging for agriculture. And so what we have is an example to keep salt water at bay through a rather large bund or wall that is created on the coastline, and then this beautifully maintained system that transfers water in and out of canals and ponds and dikes to create this seasonal system of food growing, fish farming that adapts between saltwater and freshwater in a really versatile way. And those are the two systems. One is a brackish and one is a freshwater that are incredibly expansive, that work at very large scales and that create a food supply for a really large population. And so they're examples that have parallels to our urban environments, our coastal environments, and some of those conditions that we see as threats to these type of environments. They provide us with a slew of solutions just by looking at how these systems work.
They're incredible examples. Now, later in the book, you also analyse contemporary design projects that are adopting different interpretations of nature-based solutions to address humanitarian and ecological problems. So again, could you describe a couple of them?
Yes, and going back to one of your earlier questions, why I wrote this book, the reason this book is divided into two sections is because so many of the questions that I had from the first book really were questions about people who are trying to understand how these precedents could be contextualized in present-day design projects and present-day urban issues that cities are facing. And so this part of the book really responds to that idea that we can infuse traditional ecological knowledge into contemporary design projects. And not that we can, we have. These projects that I profile, some of them are 10 years old. Some of them are just emerging out of their R&D phase into scaling. But it's already happening. The blueprints of the good ancestors have been drawn, have been built, have been constructed. There are projects that have been functioning for 10 years in urban environments that are combating some of the most seemingly threatening issues that are being confronted by cities: stormwater management, food, water security, issues of urban pollution, urban water pollution. And the two projects that I wanted to speak to, one of them is actually one of the most published, well-known models for dealing with urban water management, and it's the sponge city model. And around the world, this sponge city model, whether it's the World Economic Forum, the mayor of Paris, so many people are so interested in this model that was developed by Kongzhan Yu, who's an incredible landscape architect in China. And this sponge city model is really about how do you create environments in cities that can take water in, can use that water to create amazing recreational spaces, that can grow food, that can create these intertidal wetland mangrove ecosystems that allow cities to absorb water so that cities aren't confronted with massive flooding or massive tidal surges. And so it's this model that is just sort of paramount to how cities are really thinking about confronting some of the most imminent climate crises. And I wrote to Kongzhan and I said to him, you know, have you ever thought of traditional ecological knowledge, or do any of your projects thread traditional ecological knowledge into their design methodologies. And he was like, oh, of course, yes, absolutely. And he gave me a number of projects where traditionally ecological knowledge has formed the foundation over the last 10 years of his work. And this sponge city model, its foundation is TEK. And what happens is that most project profiles or articles that are written about sponge city model, they just do not speak about the TEK component of any of these projects. So it's not within the imaginings of landscape architects or mayors or city planners that TEK is already being used to create some of the most resilient urban infrastructures in our cities today. And so that's part of the really big reveal. I wanted to create a 22 project comparative list to the 22 case studies that really prove that traditional ecological knowledge is not something that could be or will be. It has been infused into our urban resilient infrastructures and landscapes. And the second project that I wanted to speak to sort of moves us away from a landscape architect relying and creating incredibly forward-thinking, futuristic, nature-based solutions using TEK to indigenous communities that are using their own traditional ecological knowledge that they have used for 13,000 years to create technologies that are combating contemporary climate issues that they're facing now. And so one of those technologies, and I think that you're going to find that this particular technology is really, really beautiful and resonant. It's a project that has been evolved by a 6th-generation women's collective. It's right near me. It's 2 hours away from New York City. It's been designed and constructed by the Shinnecock Nation. That's called the Shinnecock Kelp Farmers Initiative. It's a 6th-generation Shinnecock women's collaborative that are growing kelp to clean the waters, clean pollution out of the waters of the Shinnecock Bay. And from that kelp, which they harvest, they sell that kelp as fertilizer. So it's also becoming economic flow into the Shinnecock community. And the Shinnecock community have been working with seaweed and the sea, and they have built this incredibly strong relationship over 13,000 years. So it's this leverage of 13,000 years of traditional knowledge and ancestral systems and this relationship of reciprocity with the Shinnecock Bay that they've seen has been slowly polluting with agricultural runoff and different types of pollutants that are coming into the bay. And they're using seaweed to clean that water and to make that water more livable for all the sea creatures that live in Shinnecock Bay, by which they have a relationship, which they see as kin. And the seaweed actually cleans the water because it's something called a bio-uptaker. So as kelp grows, and kelp's a really interesting biomaterial because kelp grows about 2 feet a week. It is an incredibly fast-growing seawater creature. And so as it grows, it uptakes all the nutrients and pollutants. And by harvesting that kelp, it takes it out of the water. So it's cleaning the water at the same time. So you get that lineage of an indigenous nation really growing their own climate resilient systems, and then a landscape architect using traditional ecological knowledge to grow incredibly resilient urban infrastructures.
And as you've explained, one of your objectives throughout the Lo-TEK project has been to develop productive but sensitive ways of applying elements of or lessons learnt from ancient community-based projects to address similar problems at a much, much larger scale, the scale we need if we are going to seriously tackle the global water crisis and an escalating climate emergency. Now, what progress has been made on this?
Part of that second half of the book is really trying to showcase how many projects, whether they're those climate resilient water infrastructure projects in cities of 15 million people, or some other projects are material technologies, scientists and university groups who are working with indigenous communities to create new bio-based materials that are based upon traditional ecological knowledge systems and different types of weaving technologies to create really resilient housing that can be really quickly built in response to emergencies such as earthquakes for communities that are displaced. And so what I have seen happening is that people are really starting to understand that nature-based solutions that don't build on the DNA of place and culture, they work for a time, but they don't have the intention of building on intergenerational knowledge, and therefore they're not infused with that really long runway of being able to keep on building using elements of culture, using elements of community, and using the elements of the climate and the ecosystem that are already in place. So those types of projects don't have that intergenerational longevity. And the projects that do, like Kongshanyu Sponge City, that are really infused with that TEK, they have that ability to adapt to different situations and to really build on themselves to begin to become these autonomous systems. And so in the time that I've seen in the last 5 years, I think that I've seen that there can be well-intended projects that use nature-based technologies but don't really ever manage to get adoption because communities don't really know how to build them into their social, cultural institutions and functions. And so they might be well-intended, but they don't actually have that level of adoption. That means that they can start to work and that seed of idea can actually take shape and take off. And I think the other area that I've seen, or lessons that I've learned, is that there has to be governance structures in place to make sure that Indigenous communities, that there's a reciprocal relationship that is developed. And I think one of the biggest things that came out of the first book, that knowledge cannot be extracted. Knowledge cannot be taken from a community and used for a commercial benefit. It has to be that knowledge is protected by means of contracts, like a contract that I've been developing called the Smart Oath of Understanding, whereby communities are compensated for their technologies and for their sharing of knowledge, that we can't just begin to repeat, although well-intended, that same model of extraction that has been a very particular colonial model, and then bring this model of extraction and colonialism into this space of co-created, collaborative, nature-based solutions that are built upon the knowledge of place and culture and the DNA of site. So those are some of the sort of problems that I've seen.
And your sensitivity to the problems about rights, entitlement, protecting the legal, cultural and financial and ecological interests of the communities that conceive these projects is something that really impressed me in your work. You've talked about some of the problems that are involved there. What do you see as the solutions?
I mean, I think one of the solutions which I just discussed is this solution called the Smart Oath of Understanding. And this was a project or a contracting technology that I co-evolved with a friend of mine. And I co-evolved it for an exhibition that I had at the Barbican, whereby I co-created 3 technologies through 3 different communities and a global engineering firm, Bura Happold. And in that process of designing, which is something that I have done for 25 years as a landscape architect, I realized that what I hadn't done was really thought about the protection of that knowledge and allowed for the communities who were so willing to share their knowledge to be compensated in perpetuity for the sharing of that knowledge by a global engineering firm who most likely could profit from that sharing of knowledge. And so me as a landscape architect and a designer and an educator suddenly kind of became a bit of a legal expert in my ponderings of, how can we create systems to protect community and to really make designers and different entities who wanted to work with community to create technologies responsible and responsive, and build that relationship upon a foundation of understanding that they were entering into an agreement with a community that was about co-creation. It wasn't about taking or listening and then taking that technology and using it for the benefit of a corporation. It was using it for the benefit of all, which has always been the intention of all these technologies. That's one of the ways, but I think a really important second solution is to institutionalize indigenous knowledge systems. And I'm a huge, huge proponent of this. I came into this body of work because at 19 years old, I was studying architecture in Australia, and I had the really good luck to be doing a course that one of the seminars was called Aboriginal Environments, and every single student in Australia in that particular course was taught a course called Aboriginal Environments. And that was a really eye-opening course for me. I really understood at that moment that I had been taught a way to see the world that was absolute, that really didn't think about all the indigenous knowledge systems that had shaped the Australian landscape prior to the English coming into that land and colonizing it. And so I had a really special education, and I think a lot of people in Australia and the Australian education system, especially in architecture, is really forward thinking in how they're approaching relationship to country and how they're respecting and acknowledging and institutionalizing indigenous knowledge systems. But when I arrived in America, I found that was an absolute dearth of institutionalization of knowledge systems and an acknowledgement that this land was occupied by so many very sophisticated First Nations communities prior to colonization. And I think that here in the US, where I now live, then it really needs to, and there is a very strong movement towards changing that. And so that happens in institutions, that happens through governance, that happens through education, not only education in design schools, but also education at the high school and middle school level. And so I am a huge advocate, along with the woman who wrote the foreword, the scientist, Dr. Lila June Johnston, in advocating for institutionalizing Indigenous knowledge systems as part of the foundation of how we're taught as designers, how we're taught as humans to exist in this world and on this planet, and to how to co-create and to imagine a future on a really thriving and living planet.
Realistically, and it's a horrible question to have to ask, to what degree has the Trump presidency complicated the likelihood of there being a genuine national attempt to understand these issues and to embrace and enact change?
Yes. I will say that there was so much put in place by the previous administration that was incredible. The previous administration mandated that traditional ecological knowledge had to become part of the foundation of every single government's bodies. And that was an incredibly progressive and forward-thinking and a hugely groundbreaking change that happened with the last presidency. I'm not sure that Donald Trump is actually, or this administration is actually focused on dismantling that, what was put in place previously. I don't think it's going to be acknowledged. He hasn't spoken about that particularly yet. But in so many ways, this next presidency is going to derail so much of what has happened and the steps that are being taken. On a flip side of that, it's the second time. We saw what happened in the previous Trump administration. We saw the massive groundswell of the Me Too movement. We saw Black Lives Matter movement. We saw a huge shift. It was in a very particular and very unique time, which was COVID, but we saw a huge shift in and a ground sweep, grassroots movement towards supporting a climate resilient movement. And I think we will see that again. And I know that I'm incredibly inspired to set up networks and to speak to my colleagues and to do as much as we can in the face of funding being removed, words like DEI being erased from the current conversations that are happening. I mean, it's just absolute insanity. But I'm really hopeful that this is the last drowning efforts and cries of a regime that we will see that is very quickly pushed to the side.
Well, let's hope so. And you're absolutely right that regimes like this tend to catalyse activism. I mean, exactly the same phenomenon with Margaret Thatcher in the UK in the 1980s. It was an extraordinary decade of political protest and action. So finally, if we go back to Lo-TEK, which obviously is an ongoing mission for you, how do you want it to develop from here? And what, for you, would success look like?
How I want it to develop from here. I mean, the intention with Lo-TEK has always been that the design field, the people who are shaping and creating and leading the urban environments and the systems and cities, whether it be governance, economics, built environment, food, agriculture, fashion, that Lo-TEK is really impacting the framework of some of these systems, and that there is an acknowledgement that we can't just be blindsided by high tech, and we can't just think that the way so many people think that high tech is going to solve this climate crisis in the future. Somebody's going to come along and it'll all be resolved. My ambition is that, and I see it already happening through my writing and writing of so many incredible indigenous thinkers, that there is a huge awakening that we can't ignore the past, and we would be so naive and immature if we were to do that. That there are examples like Mexico City's past of the ancient city that was there, that cities that are incredibly biodiverse and well-functioning and nature-based can support really sophisticated civilizations. We don't have to ignore high tech. I think what this next book is really trying to showcase is that there can be a beautiful blend between the best of high tech and the most sophisticated understandings of low-tech guided by indigenous knowledge systems and local communities on how to design systems and cities and infrastructures that allow both ecosystems and all the creatures that live within those ecosystems, as well as the human creatures, us, to coexist and thrive relying on one another. And we have these examples. It's not inconceivable. It's existing. What we know is that if we ignore these signposts and these examples, that we just dive deeper and deeper into peril. And so my hope, really, and I've said this from the very beginning when Lo-TEK first came out, is I hope that in 20 years, let's say 2045, that my children, who are now 3.5 and 1.5, they can open the book and they can look through the pages, and what they'll see is not something that was once an idea that remains in the sort of archive of architectural history, But they'll recognize this as the seeds and the imaginings of the cities that they live in. And that what has happened is that humanity has really moved through a stage of this fascination of high tech and understood that there can be incredibly fertile and fruitful and really exciting and deeply engaging spaces and systems that are blended with high tech and low tech. And we don't have to maintain this colonial imperialistic model, which I think, just going back to what we spoke about, this Trump presidency is trying so hard to foreground as one of their biggest pushes, like this imperialism that I'm seeing bubble to the surface, that we can co-create a future if we understand that the innovations of the present, both the high tech and the low tech, can be part of that equation.
Well, Julia, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And not that you'll need it, because the book's terrific. The very best of luck with it. And thank you to everyone for listening. You can find images of the projects that Julia's discussed on our Instagram feed at design.emergency. And we look forward to welcoming you back to Design Emergency soon, when we'll be exploring other fascinating and urgently needed developments in design, like Julia's work on low-tech water. Goodbye.